I would like to use a photographer's metaphor that each of us simply using a different lens, uh, so-called different perspectives. So I think I have a lot of common attention, the same attention as Lord. We're probably looking at the same stuff, but from a different lens. So,
Interesting.
so the title is called Cultural Gene Hypothesis. And I had done this in Chinese language once, so this time is an English presentation. The idea trace back to this group of authors, W.D. Hamilton. He he presented the idea of biological genetic basis for altruism, studied that. And Richard Dawkins from 1941 wrote that famous book, Selfish Gene. And he invented this term me, coming from a Greek mimemi, which means it's something like a DNA, but it's a cultural format, and it can be transmitted from generation to generation, but also horizontally within the same generation. So I think Dawkins is the first person maybe talking about the cultural gene. And comes Daniel Dennett. He did this work on metics, and so further defined, further clarified Dawkins' concept. Memes as a unit of a culture, an idea, a belief, a pattern of behavior, etc., hosted in the minds of individuals. Now here, we're coming back to Bernard's side. It's a little thing hosted within one mind, but it can also be shared by a group of minds, as Pascal term individual versus individual. And then later, this Benedict Anderson, he wrote this also very influential book, Imaging Community, and I think he has getting closer to the idea of self-organization and the formation of communities through imagination, or in Lloyd's term, from formation of a shared meaning. So that's some pioneers, I call. And Hendrich, in 2016, he pointed out that cultural elements, actually he is currently the anthropology department chair for Harvard. So his book is also influential. His point is that cultural elements speed up our evolution. So here he mixed the biological evolution with the cultural evolution together. He offered examples like our food choice, mate choice, the use of tools, technology, our language, and categories, decision-making, beliefs, blah, 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 all the way to self-regulation and judgment heuristics. But I highlighted decision-making methods, beliefs, and the social norms and standards as my focus. I mean, Heinrich's perception is kind of like a wide angle. And I would like to zoom in to look at the details of what's exactly hidden there. So I call it a cultural gene. Yeah, this just simulates my focus is narrow. So how this concept emerged? First, let's review this four major perspectives of biological evolution. And you see Darwin here, and Waddington here, Baldwin here, and Lamarck here. And they're talking about the same thing, but not the same thing. If you look into detail, Darwin simply says, well, change the environment and mutation, etc., existing variation, etc., lead to natural selection and and then adaptive inherit change. Now, Waddington focused on that in the environment there are some strong shock, big changes in environment, etc., that will cause genetic assimilation, something changed in your biological gene, and then leads to natural selection and adaptation. Now, Baldwin, I should say Lamarck first. Lamarck put a different view other than Darwin. He said something caused the change of needs. And the change of needs causes change of behavior. And the change of behavior, more use and disuse of the structure, and created for example, our jaw, as we invented fire to start eating cooked food, our jaw becomes shorter and shorter. We don't need strong muscles to chew. And then that shrink of the chewing muscle left room for our brain to become bigger. So it's all interactive here. And Baldwin made a different branch. He says that, okay, because the change of needs, he emphasized learned behavior. And this thing is more culturally oriented because the learned behavior exists in mind, not in biological genes. So this is a little review diagram for what's the major philosophers or theorists talking about evolution. And in 2007, in the Vienna Summer CEO program, these two slides are among my presentations to the Summer CEO program. I first defined the cultural gene code hypothesis, saying that microphenomena in organizations and societies are functions of organizational behaviors, and organizational behaviors can be traced back to cultural gene codes in addition to psychological motives. Because psychological motives can happen anywhere, anytime, at any individual. But cultural gene codes are only specific to specific culture, linked to the specific environment. So cultural genes can be re-engineered or used in new context. So at that time, like 2007, I emphasize the gene code as ideals, values, moral principles that are passed from generation to generation through stories, proverbs, quotations, and texts used in education via family teaching, schooling, church going, should be movie going. Sorry, it's not moving going, it's movie going. Hollywood is a big cultural gene warehouse and the self-study. So in 2009, in the Florida conference, I further pushed it into call it a behavior cultural gene code. And based on this code, we can develop a measurement for organizational efficiency. And these are the Chinese talk I made in 2010 at Harvard Kennedy School. that was focused on a new term I call communism, Chinese type of communism, which is different from original communism. And by analyzing this communism concept, I analyzed two sets of cultural genes. One set coming from the Chinese tradition, and another set comes from Soviet communism. So one set plus multiplied two set created a new breed of ghost. In 2014 in Vienna, I presented this paper, Cultural Genes as Key Variables in the Paths of Country Development. In other words, I was trying to figure out how it really works. It's not just my subjective perception. It's something working there that we can find examples in history. And here, I used this concept of rule of law, and I discussed how this concept of rule of law emerged and how it spread in different countries, how long, what kind of a path each country went on. So that was a little bit of history. Now, theoretically background, I first relied on what I call multiple layers of self-organization. Because you have at a very deep level, at very deep background, you have your concept of formation, and then you have idea linkages and linking multiple concepts, and voice expression of ideas leading to group coordination, and then you have language formulated to carry these coordination, to enable this for coordination. And then later you have written language, which is I see as the next level of formalization. And then you have measurement, accounting, arithmetics, logic developed. Layer by layer, these things develop. So it's kind of a genesis of how this whole thing come into being, multiple layers. And among these layers, here, beliefs and know-hows is what we are focusing at. We're focusing at here, not everything else here. And and you climb up, you have critical thinking, you form philosophy, you have science, but now we're going back to this layer, the beliefs hidden in our mind. So again, I narrow down the focus of attention. So to borrow from biology, in biology we have an individual, but in society we have organization. In biology you have an organ. In society you have a functional group. And we have a cell, we have an individual here, we have a circle here, we have a mind here, and we have a chromosome here, we have our religion, ideology, story system here. And what they call DNA and RNA, I can call cultural DNA at this level. So it's very isomorphic that we can almost map everything in biology, boom, into sociology. So when they say gene, we say cultural gene. A biological gene can have dominant ones, or recessive ones, hidden ones. A cultural gene also we can have active ones versus hidden ones. And the cell metabolism, and for here is equal to decision making in our daily activities. So that's an analogy. And the difference, the major difference is in biological systems, the biological gene can only transfer vertically, and the mutation is through generations. But in here, for the cultural gene scenario, we have both vertical and horizontal transmission, mutation, fusion, crossbreed, etc., through and among generations. In other words, in the same generation, even in the same person, that a big shock can change, can reprogram your cultural gene. That's the difference, major difference.
We
Now,
highly agree on this, isn't it? The similar point about horizontal and vertical differentiation.
yeah. So, so let me finish. The format of a cultural gene defined by me is a very simple code. I call it BBC, the belief behavior code. In a format, if X, then Y1, else Y2, because of Z. Now, X, Y, Z has their definition too. We can say if X may mean the current condition. Okay, currently I realized I'm facing some kind of X kind of a situation. Then I need to do action 1. And if not this condition, I do action 2. Because of internal model, because my internal model, my theory, my working hypothesis, my belief. So this is a very, I think you can narrow down what this concept into its naked format. And here, belief includes know-how and know-why. For computer, it is given by programmer. Okay, everybody who knows computer science able to write this piece of code because the programmer is the god of the computer. So programmer write this. But for our human beings, it is given, this code is given by our culture or by invention. Somebody invented, let's say, Moses invented the 10 Commandments, and they become a strong cultural gene. Here are some examples. Some very simple case. Get up. Alarm clock sound is your cognition result. So you have because here that demands you action as a get up. And if you don't hear alarm sound, you keep sleeping. Okay, behind this behavior choice, it's the piece of belief. I must get up on time. If you delete this piece of belief, then alarm sound become useless to you, meaningless to you. So this is why I'm asking Lloyd your definition about meaning and the horizontal meaning. Second one, driving a car. If I see red light, I stop. Otherwise, I go ahead. I must obey traffic law. Accepting a wedding proposal. Okay, I need to see a proposal diamond ring big enough. So then I say yes. And then otherwise I say no. What happened? I'm jumped too hard, too quickly. Okay, so you got the idea. So because behind every decision making, there is a piece of belief here. Okay, first Chinese official seeing a world map first time in 1584. The cognition was a ridiculous thing. And so So their action is to ask the guy to redraw it so that China will be in the center of that map. Uh, and they fear it's big trouble because it's shaking their worldview and the world map is something very threatening uh, because the Asian Chinese people believe, of course, we should be the center of the all and the heaven, or the center of the world. Now, the first British state guest visit Qing Emperor in 1792. The conclusion is a foreigner arrives to propose a relationship, and the action is treat him a good dinner and ask him to go back. And otherwise treat him a good dinner and ask him to go. Either way, it's the same here because we don't know what a relationship is. Can you believe that? That's exactly happened in 1792. Now, Tiananmen Square, 1989. Cognition was a student had a demonstration. And CCP's action was to use force to crack it down. Otherwise, even without demonstration, they think things are okay. So, because the belief is the students threat their power. So those are some examples. And how many lines of code are there inside Windows 10? There are 50 million lines of codes. And Windows XP, the 35 million codes. And Windows 95 is 15. So the earlier, the primitive, the simpler you can see. The complexity was pretty low. Microsoft DOS, if you still remember that, has 13,587 lines of code. Now, the first computer I played with have 13 lines of code that we have to hand input with a line of switches. Human brain is not, but more than a computer. So just like human eyes are not, but more than cameras. Now, not every line of code are value code, just those at which a decision will be made. So, in other words, in this whole evolutionary processes, they are something changing, evolving as human society grow into more and more civilized stage. So at some point, biological evolution was replaced by cultural evolution. And somebody recently just did a calculation. In our human brain, averagely, information is 1 TB. So now currently you can buy a 4 TB, 8 TB hard disk from Costco. So cultural genes can spread very slowly. Here is an example of the way people conduct town meetings. I mean, when the public has an issue, people getting together into the center place of the village and discuss it, communicate it, and form a consensus. Who invented that? I digged out it was invented in this, the archaeology, the historians found evidence that the earliest of this kind of a town meeting was in Spain in 1188. And then it evolves, it spread to Barcelona and spread to Montpellier and to Toulouse see the numbers, the years it emerged, and at this time it came to England, and from at this time came to Poland and Denmark, same thing Sweden, and the Russians, the latest place they learned this method. So so this method is this idea of a parliament idea. Uh, had this historical pathway, so it's pretty slow. And the years needed to grow a constitution here, you find that UK is the pioneer, started from this about this time, and spent almost 300, more than 300 years, and established this constitution or government, parliamentary government. And for United States, started from here to here, and for France, it's later from here to here. Russian from here to here, and Germany. This is with the assistance of World War II. And China, Taiwan, jump back. China, Taiwan spend this much time. And the China mainland is still a question mark. It's still not there yet.
The Netherlands is 1580. Jason, the Netherlands is 1580.
Netherlands, 1580. Yeah, we should add your country there. They are very much diversified too, the cultural genes. Here I will invoke a sociological concern, which I call bear curve 2.0. It's not 2.0 because the bear curve 1.0 was blamed and attacked and disputed because they related IQ with the color of skin. And I have nothing to do with the color of skin, but I'm focused on the cognitive capability of people. In other words, the biological hardware in any given time, any brain's scope of awareness is different. The scope of awareness equals the function of your experience, your education, and your thinking. And based on the scope of awareness, you develop your value, preference, priority, and based all of above, the cultural gene code are different at the different sigma positions. Sigma position, I mean the bell curve. So from -4 sigma to 4 sigma, this is the percentage of any population that had a different capacity of cognitive power. In other words, their meaning and their horizon of meaning are different. And if you go very extreme, the number become very, very small. But we do have people here, for example, at the 6 sigma, at this rate, we have people like Albert Einstein or Goddard, or who develop stuff that many of us have to learn very hard to understand. So this is the image of the bear curve 2.0. I just put all the percentage of population in each category. I want to emphasize that in each category, they have different cultural genes at a different level of complexity. For example, on the left side, religion are very useful for this side, but signs are very useful for this side, and popular public opinions focus on this. So roughly we can divide them into 14 groups. And I have been talking about the fate of science and cybernetics, etc. I want to emphasize that 7.6 million people only occupy this little area, 0.1% of the Earth's population. They had a science education. I mean, they can call themselves a scientist with an occupation of doing science. So we need to pay attention to what's going on in all these areas. And many times that people have two different type of cultural gene codes. One is to use, I call vertical one, they use themselves in daily education. The other I call propaganda. They talk to other people. So these two types of cultural gene codes, if you look closer, you find that some people do one thing, but they say another thing, or they say something, but they behave differently. So if we consider both IQ and EQ in the same time, we have this 3D image of actual distribution of a bell curve, and also they change. So evolution, I'm making connection with Leo's idea is here, right here in this moving thing of analogy of the evolution of cultural genes. So what if X routine equals routine or habits? So if this X is stable, so it's every you have it, the if sentence becomes a non-if, so it becomes a direct execution code, and so this cognition here outputs nothing new. So no new decision is needed in such cases. And I'm about to finish, and here is the open ending. A few more examples. One example is language. Language might play a very important role. For example, here, I noticed that when talking about the facts, establishing facts, English has a very tidy pattern of promoting the brain to make the facts right. So it's this who, why, when, where, what, and there's a how here. In German, it's even more tidy. It's all started with the W. We, was, who, one, warum, when. But in French, it's not that tidy. So I was trying to explain why French people seem more disorganized than German. You may agree or may not agree, but that's my observation. And in Swahili, you don't see the same tidiness as in German and English, and the things are more chaotic within the people using this language. So that's one tentative example. The second one will be the floating kitten story that Stuart told us last time, and the floating kitten had a different, or maybe you can call it a cultural gene because it's interactive with the environment. It's not biological already. So the two kittens got a different programming, so they behave differently. One more example would be, well, I actually made a 1 hour program talking about the competing cultural gene groups in China. And basically, I call it a panda gene group versus the dragon gene group. The panda gene group is consistent with what we call universal value of the word, and they want to be part of the world and to join the civilization. But the dragon gene group uh, perceive the world completely different. The world is a place they need to conquer, and, and they need to take over. So that I had another program talking about this. So I will stop here just for a few examples. I'm done.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
Very nice, Jason. Particularly the summary of the evolution theory and the literature.
Oh, we have Laura here. So questions?
Jason,
Yes.
I liked your presentation. The idea of a cultural gene, I have a problem with, just in the sense that genes are made of both DNA and RNA. And like the virus, coronavirus, it's a RNA, which is a messenger. It's the communication interaction. It's the Pony Express carrying messages back and forth that get modified as they interact with the environment, with the demands. So I would just suggest that it's not a cultural gene in the sense that there is a paradigm, but the paradigm has a different logic and different level than the messengers. And because communication can go downwards and somewhat upwards, but you can't control downwards to upwards. And so going back to Lot's ideas about evolution, which I found very profound, may I suggest that you also think about RNA as a messenger as well as the paradigm of the DNA or coding.
Of course, you are one step ahead of me. You're looking at more details. I'm just at this stage just trying to establish this concept hypothesis first, and then we can do more detailed analyze and classify again between DNA and RNA and agents. I'm currently only using Bernard's idea. We are currently only focused on what's going on within one brain at micro moment, at that decision making moment. What's really make us making that decision? So it's just reveal a hidden element on the background, and then we can look at it in more detail.
And what you can use your program that you're doing, Jason, in terms of our 3 levels of discussion, which is both theory, tools, and practicum, so that we can think about how does your ideas, how Lot's ideas interject at each level, and what do we need to add to that to understand, and then go to Jamie's question that she began with, which is how do we get this to a larger audience with more tools? We are just sitting here trying to figure out what the differential diagnosis of the problem of thinking is now. And secondly, how do we then get it to a larger audience?
Currently, this is really our meeting of minds. We just trying to argue with each other to figure things out more clearly. And for the larger audience, I think we all have recordings, and we will put these recordings to YouTube. And I believe that more audience will feedback from the recording. That should be no problem. I like your three-layer, three-circle thing very much. And actually, I prepared a little slides for last our last discussion. I think Jenny also had prepared something answering your question of what is system change. I think in next Wednesday we probably will step into that area.
Just one other
Yes.
point. You have the IQ and EQ, IQ being intelligence, EQ being in motion. What we need to be thinking about is CQ, collective intelligence.
Exactly, of course. that's what we are working on right now.
And that relates to the RNA that I was talking about as a messenger. So
sure. But Bernard, you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment as well. What I like very much is the way you express norms, cultural norms as rule-based. And it's interesting. I found in the literature in the sociology literature of institutions there are things called institutional grammars, which set up a classification of different kinds of norms, rules that can operate in institutions. And there's also something called the institutional logics perspective, which is a kind of, as far as I can tell, a USA alternative to the various sociologies which happen in Europe. But I like this basis on the rule. The only, I've mentioned before, that the only quibble I have, or the problem I have, is with the term cultural gene. I just tend to think of genes as biological, and so, but that's a matter of preference, not choice. And the other thought is that the past concept of a concept is that it is a rule, a procedure, which does things, which brings things about, and he also makes a distinction between concepts of the why and the how. So there's a kind of rich overlap there, which I see. And while I'm talking, I apologize to Lute for if I became a bit heated when we mentioned lumen. This is a conversation for another place and another time, perhaps a lifetime. I don't know, but I've invested much in, as you pointed out, I've invested much in past perspective, and I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the merits in lumens, but these are separate conversations.
Yes.
Actually,
Yes.
Stuart suggested that we do a session focused on lumen and invite Lloyd to give us a thorough treatment of lumen. Is that what you mean,
Yeah,
Stuart?
we have these conversations almost every year in RC51 on social cybernetics.
Okay.
There are a group of pro-lumen people who use this theory in different ways. It's very complex theory in different ways. And there's another group who are quite anti-lumen and criticize him quite well. And then there are other people who are indifferent. So, but we have many, many conversations. And I enjoy them because each time I've read much lumen, but I haven't read all of it. Each time I learn something, and I gain better arguments from my side as to why I'm not a Lumanian in the full sense, although there are aspects of his thinking, his theorizing, which I do like. And all this is, yes, another conversation. I'd enjoy that.
Oh, but let me first say, Jenny, may I make this point? That I am not a Lumanian at all. I'm much more an information theorist than Luhmann ever was. And I think it is very important to see, Gumbrecht made that point, that there's a Luhmann 1, Luhmann 2, Luhmann 3, and there's the Luhmann of the discussions with Habermas, which I think is very strong. Then there's the Luhmann who took the Maturana idea and applied it to society, which is a very constructive and inventive phase in his career, 80s. And then there's the Luhmann of the 90s, who became a philosopher, a grandiose philosopher, with Spencer Brown in the background, which I think should be thrown away.
This could be a very interesting conversation.
Yes. I had a question that's at the intersection of Jason and Lud. It's there is what is called the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, dus in evolution, and that comes from Frans de Waal, I believe, and that actually it coheres with Popper's view of evolution, and that is that the ability to manipulate is what allowed humans to make progress in terms of organizing themselves in leaders and followers and doing division of labor. And so I'm wondering whether you would like to comment on that. There is a tendency that people just use the analogy and they kind of say, okay, now we're going to explain how humans further evolve, and then an analogy is done with the Darwinian model of evolution. But the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, I think, is actually not an analogy. It's just telling literally how something changed in the brain that allowed people to lie and use lies effectively. And that is actually what we're seeing today in society. So it's actually a question for everyone, but since
Can
you
put that reference in the chat box so we can do
yes.
some homework on that?
Yeah.
I think it is important to ask the question, what is evolving? So as soon as we leave behind the biological models, then people are inclined to think of our brains evolving. But that's not the case. We can excellently understand the Roman writers like Cicero or Julius Caesar. We can excellently understand their motives, their understanding, their functioning, their longings. That's not the evolving. What is evolving is the complexity in the communication. And
Yes.
it is the complexity. So what is then evolving is the interaction among the codes, in my opinion. And this is Lumanian conception of code, which goes back to Parsons in a way. And I think it is very fruitful to then entertain Herbert Simon's idea that every system has an alphabet. So there are not a couple of codes, there's an whole alphabet. So let's say between 20 and 25. And these codes come also back in Jason's presentation when he says we have this statement, if x1, if x, then I1, and else y2, because there is z, and the z is the code. Would you agree, Jason?
Yes. Sorry if I interrupt. And that brings up, I think, an opportunity for further development for you, Jason, when you talk about the cognitive capacity and the complexity and your bell curve 2.0. I think there's a little bit of misrepresentation of how things happen. Like, for instance, Einstein, he just didn't develop his ideas on his own. He was in a community of people, and he very actively worked together with all these people around him, to begin with his wife, that is like well documented, that she did most of the equations. And then also when he wrote his papers, he used the work of, I mean, he just built on a lot of other people. So the reason we all talk about Einstein is because he was very photogenetic, and he was a social butterfly, so to say. The kind of the media developed that image of him, but there are like many other people that supported him. So what I'm getting at is the thing that Lowell, and I think also maybe Bernard and Lud bring up, is the communication strategies. So I don't see in your Bell 2.0 the role of communication strategies. So it's not about knowing something, it's about being able to communicate it to a large enough group of people that they run with the idea. So so that's a question for you. How would you incorporate that in your model, Jason?
Yeah, you use a new word I invented. It's called communicatics.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a number of theories and the tools to use to improve the effectiveness and the efficiency of communication among different perspectives. Okay, because if there's the same perspective, you don't need a communication. The point is my thinking and your thinking are kind of far away from each other, and we're making effort to getting closer, and perhaps we can enter into some kind of a coordination. And that is not a remote academic issue. It's a very daily issue for all the organizations, businesses, governments, and everywhere. So that is completely a different topic than today. Today we just want to figure out this thing called the cultural evolution and based on cultural gene.
Can I make, Jason, another remark upon you? I suggest that the communication at the social level can be very precisely set where that starts. It is, in my opinion, I would suggest it is not the Constitution. It is when people begin to translate the Bible in their vernacular.
Mm.
So that was forbidden, to communicate, to see that as something else than as sacrosanct, and to begin to see that as something which can be translated. And people were sentenced to death, like Jan Hus in Czech Republic. He was the first one who tried that. He was sentenced to death for it. Luther managed to do that. And that's where we get this option that we can differ of opinion. Of course, we can always differ of opinion at the daily life, but not at the level of society.
Mm-hmm.
If I could address,
hand raised.
I'm sorry?
Jamie had a hand raising sign.
No, that's a while ago. Yeah,
Okay.
I'll lower it.
Lois wants to say something.
yeah, Jamie, let me address your question about the Machiavellian hypothesis. I think we've been looking at Darwinian evolution incorrectly. The point about human consciousness is what we should be focusing on, what the nature of consciousness is, including cognition. But cognition is a coin, and the other side of the coin is deception, as well as reception. So conception, reception, deception is all part of the same package of interactions when you start extracting from the world and models and seeing and changing your models and perspectives of how to do something. I mean, a crow will sit there and figure out some different strategies of how to open a lock, etc., but it has to have a model of what it's doing, and it's very effective on that, at that level. But what I think is important is the idea that Lutz talked about initially, which is we are historical beings. We always have to have eyes in the back of our heads to know the patterns that have influenced us over time. So it's not a matter of the gladiator pit of survival of the fittest, but it's what we've been talking about today, which is arrival of the fittest, and how the democratic experiment, the ideas of translation of Bibles, moving away from a deductive interpretation by the powerful of what a word means in propaganda. So the idea that is not just necessarily a communication lock within a paradigm, but how do you move paradigms in different directions, not because it's intellectually curious or logical, but because it's related to survival. And so the Machiavellian is only one side of the coin. The other side is the ability to conceive and deceive and understand the conceptions that we are trapped within. And so it's beyond Machiavelli.
Can I give an example? So in the end of the Middle Ages, there was the state of Burgundy. There were the Dukes of Burgundy, and they had a problem because they were not sacrosanct. On the one side, there was France with a king, with an anointed king, who also had a holy power. And on the other side, there was the Holy Empire of Germany. And in the middle, there was the Empire of the Middle, they called it, Burgundy and the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Lotharinge, Lorraine. And they didn't know how to make themselves legitimate. And then what they invented was the guilder. They invented the idea that they could get legitimacy through money. And that was new. So they created a union of the guilder with its center in Belgium. It eroded again, but in that they found the legitimacy to tax and things like that. So you get another code of communication, namely transactions in money, which can be organized stronger so that it can overcome the religious codes on the other side.
Yeah, if I may give an example, I'm thinking about, and maybe the example is simplistic, but I think it's the Neanderthalers that they found like graves or something that gave the evidence that there was a belief in an afterlife, and that they just put all this object in the grave to allow for the passage to the afterlife. And so our current theories give the impression that poof, like a computer out of nowhere, this idea came of the afterlife, and that it is a good idea for a community. But if you kind of think about it deeper, and using the model of storytelling, is that some people saw the distress, just in these primitive societies, the distress because someone had died, and that someone started telling the story. No, he didn't die. He transitioned to another world, and that story kind of just was germinating, that people like that story and they run with it. But that at the same time, there were a group of people kind of realizing there was no evidence whatsoever. But instead of saying it's just a story, they just say, oh, let's go along with it. And that kind of gave rise to religious systems. Dus where there's a lots of rituals developed, but dus that I hypothesize, and I think that's part of the Machiavellian hypothesis, that there was always an inner circle who knew that there was zero evidence for whatever the story was telling, but that it was very convenient because it allowed people to direct other people to behave in a certain way. And then we got like a hierarchical structure, and there were these great benefits to having the stories being retold over and again. And I'm making implicitly a reference to the work of Bernard Scott about the monotheistic religions. And so I'm kind of maybe freely interpreting your work, but that these religions, they filled a psychological need, and we can see that today. But so I'm trying to imagine how did this happen? What was like the first event? And so that I see it as a storytelling, that a story that was created for good reasons, just to help people, to comfort them, but that then someone saw an opportunity to manipulate and so that we maybe can use that as a hypothesis to explain human evolution.
Building on what Jamie is saying, when you're thinking about social change and transformation, it's important to be looking at what you talked about in terms of power and powerlessness, because power and powerlessness are systems and they complement one another. And so if you look at democratic experiments, they are trying to say, how do we create the antidotes or social change against the abuses of power? And what's interesting in my research as a cultural anthropologist, looking at cognitive archaeology and looking at the American Revolution, I was married at one time to a Scotswoman. And I said, you know, the Scottish Enlightenment is really powerful. How did they get so different and so powerful than the French Continental? And of course she said, it's simple. And I hate it when a woman tells me it's simple because I'm stupid. But she says, it was the Netherlands. It was the painting from perspective, the uses of lens, the microscope, the ability to see things in relation instead of a picture which has the priest as big as the cathedral. So the idea of perspective really influenced the Scottish Enlightenment, which then formed the tutors for Madison, James Madison, and Jefferson, and many others that formed the Constitution. But that idea of flexibility from the Protestant Reformation, that's all going back to the original point that Lut was talking about to begin with, which is we need a discipline of natural history, not of dinosaurs, but of our patterns. Because what was really insightful when I discovered the way the American revolutionary founders read history, and it was Gibbons that was able to talk about patterns in history that have consequence over time. And that was really, so how do you change the patterns to get a different consequence over time? A natural history. So we really got into evolution before they really understood evolution, but an evolution of ideas.
I was mentioning 1580 because it is there somewhere that it happened in the Netherlands. So in 1580, they were so fed up with the Spanish rule and the tyranny which came from that they decided to leave the King of Spain behind. And that, of course, was a transgression. And William of Orange wrote an apologia in Spanish for his soul because he was making this transgression and therefore would go to hell. And after that, they decided to reinstall the guilder on a different basis. And the society was accepted as pluriform. So it was not the Protestants against the Catholics, it was freedom of religion against Catholicism. And that's also where the Jews fit in, and functional differentiation began to flourish in the Netherlands. So we should talk about this another time in more detail.
Yes.
Stuart? Oh, Bernard, you want to say something?
Jason, if you've and colleagues here, it's been a great pleasure, but I'm beginning to tire, and later in about an hour and a half time, I have another online discussion coming up. So I'm going to say farewell here and go for a little rest. And I must say it's been a great pleasure indeed, seeing old friends and new, and I look forward to more conversations, Jason.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.